The death penalty is considered to be the most severe form of punishment that criminals can endure. The practice of putting criminals to death by hanging was commonplace in times past, despite the fact that our modern society has experienced a significant shift away from the application of this kind of punishment in recent decades. Convicted criminals were frequently subjected to cruel and unusual punishments, including torturing and execution, in order to demonstrate to the general populace the repercussions of leading a life of crime. Every nation on the face of the earth has developed novel approaches of carrying out the execution of the death penalty. The majority of the time, the goal was to inflict as much suffering on the offender for as long as possible, but other times, the method that was used had some kind of symbolic significance behind it. However, criminals seldom met a death that could be considered noble. In point of fact, their corpses were frequently put on display for added public humiliation. In this video, we are going to cover 10 most horrible and gruesome forms of capital punishment that were used in ancient times. Lingchi, slow slicing. Lingchi was a cruel kind of execution that was practiced in China. In this method, the prisoner would be subjected to a number of stab wounds until eventually passing away from blood loss. The objective of the executioners was to make as many incisions as they could and remove as many pieces of flesh as they could without really killing the victim. In some circles, it was also referred to as death by 1,000 cuts. Lingchi was practiced as early as the 9th century but was made illegal in 1905. One of the few techniques of execution on this list for which there are real photographs of it being carried out, the guillotine was around at the turn of the 20th century when it was first used. There was not a predetermined procedure that led to the creation of Lingchi. The manner in which it was carried out was determined by a number of aspects, including the competence and compassion of the person carrying it out, as well as the gravity of the offense that was committed. According to some tales, the victims were subjected to as many as 3,000 incisions before they passed away, although other accounts state that the entire process took little more than 15 minutes. The documents were discovered during the Ming Dynasty. It is unknown whether the condemned were administered opium with the intention of increasing or decreasing their level of suffering when they were given it on occasion. It might have helped them remain conscious for a longer period of time. The 5 punishments were a scale of punishment that increased in severity from mild to severe. One of the most severe variations of this scale was called Lingchi. It encompassed a wide variety of disciplinary measures, such as amputation of the nose or feet, exile, tattooing, and even castration for the worst offenders. Sawing. In Europe during the Middle Ages, individuals who were found guilty of committing crimes such as witchcraft, adultery, murder, blasphemy, or theft could be sawn to death. The Roman Empire had a propensity for sawing people in half horizontally. However, the Chinese were more innovative by hanging their victims by their feet and sawing vertically down the body of their victims. This technique was more successful in inflicting pain on victims because it increased the flow of blood to the brain, resulting in the victims remaining aware for a longer period of time. The victims of the Czech Hussite reform movement were subjected to having their hands and feet sawed off before having their wounds cauterized by a torch, as evidenced by the historical sources from the time period in which the movement took place. After that, the victim would be sawn in half using a saw. Regarding the history of ancient Rome, it was said that Caligula would eat his meals while watching individuals being sawed to death, taking pleasure in the anguish of those who were being severely punished. Execution by elephant. This sort of punishment, which is sometimes referred to as gunga rao, was most commonly used in Asia and India. Nevertheless, there is some evidence that this practice was occasionally utilized in the Western world. Since the Middle Ages, one method of carrying out the sentence of death in India is by means of being dragged to death by an elephant. The perpetrators of crimes like as thievery, tax evasion, and insurrection were frequently the ones who found themselves in the position of victim. Elephants were employed for executions despite the availability of a wide variety of other creatures that could be used for the same purpose. This was due to the fact that elephants could be taught to both torment and kill offenders. For instance, a victim's limbs could be crushed by an elephant before the animal was instructed to give the fatal blow to the victim's head by its handler. François Bernier, a French traveler, was present during an additional instance of a person being put to death by elephant. The elephant was taught to use blades that were attached to its tusks in order to execute offenders according to this strategy. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. If a man were to be found guilty of high treason in England, this would be the most severe punishment that could be handed down to him under the law. Instead of men, morality demanded that women be put to death by being burned at the stake. Those who were found guilty of high treason were, up until the year 1870, led to their place of execution by being dragged by a horse while they were bound to a hurdle or sledge, which resembled a piece of fencing constructed out of thin twigs that were woven together. When they arrived at their destination, the culprit would be hanged without a drop being allowed to fall on their neck in order to prevent the neck from breaking. The criminal would have his throat cut, his genitalia severed, and an opening made in his stomach before he was put to death. After that, the perpetrator's internal organs would be pulled out of his body, and his head would be severed from his body. At this point, the deceased individual's body would be cut into quarters. Often, the head and quarters of the criminal would be parboiled to prevent them from rotting and posted on the city gates as a warning for everyone to see. This was done as a public spectacle for everyone to see. This cruel way of putting someone to death was first used in 1241 to execute William Maurice, who was found guilty of piracy and sentenced to death. The Treason Act of 1814 made it official to do away with the element of this mode of execution that involved disemboweling, and it replaced it with hanging, now with a drop that may break the neck, and post-mortem decapitation instead. Gibbeting. In Scotland, those who were found guilty of murder were the most likely candidates for this method of the death penalty. The Murder Act of 1752 stipulated that the bodies of criminals who were put to death by hanging or dissection must be carried out in accordance with the law. Although it was still a permissible form of capital punishment up until the year 1834, the practice of gibbeting ceased to be common by the late 1770s. The fact that the body of the culprit would be shown in public places, which came with its fair share of evident problems, contributed to the gradual downfall of this particular method of carrying out the death penalty. The conviction of Alexander Gillen is the most successful application of this particular form of the death penalty. In the year 1810, he was found guilty of both the rape and the murder of a young girl by the name of Elspeth Lamb, who was 11 years old at the time. She was working hard to herd her father's cattle when her father viciously abused her and ultimately caused her death by beating her. The Lord Justice Clerk of that time wanted to pass on a death sentence that would be considered an exemplary response to the magnitude of the crime. So he decided that Gillen would be executed on the very same spot that the body of his victim was found, and that his body would be hanged in chains to serve as a reminder of the consequences that come along with murdering someone. Immurement. In this form of punishment, the guilty offender would be placed inside of a room that was completely sealed up and did not have any exits. In some cases, this meant that the victims would be imprisoned for the rest of their lives, while in other cases, they would be doomed to a death sentence consisting of starvation and dehydration. Immurement was featured in a photograph that was initially published in a 1922 issue of National Geographic. The photograph showed a Mongolian woman being held captive within a wooden box in the middle of the desert. Albert Kahn, the photographer, was present whenever the woman put in an appearance to solicit food, because it would have been a serious violation of procedure for an anthropologist to interfere with the legal process of another culture. He had no choice but to keep her locked up in the container. According to Kahn, the woman was found guilty of adultery at some point in her life. In spite of the fact that there were holes in the explanation about why she was doomed to suffer this destiny, the photo possesses a genuineness that cannot be questioned. It's not always the case that victims perished from famine. According to an article that was published in a newspaper in 1914, victims of this destiny in China were entombed in hefty iron-bound coffins that did not allow them the ability to sit up straight or lie down. They would be able to see sunlight for a little period of time each day, but only for a few minutes, as their food was lowered into their coffins through a tiny hole. Poena cullei. Those who were found guilty of killing a parent, also known as parricide, would have their bodies sewed into a leather sack, together with a variety of live animals, and then thrown into a body of water. This practice was also known as the punishment of the sack. Poena cullei was first mentioned in the material that was discovered, and this documentation said that the sack was only used to hold snakes. However, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, One of the most common variations of the Poena cullei involved placing the prisoner in a sack together with a rooster, a dog, a monkey, and a viper. During that era, persons who were found guilty of parricide were given the option of either being thrown to the beasts in an arena or being subjected to the punishment of Poena cullei. People who were given the sentence of Poena cullei were first flogged or beaten with blood-colored rods before having their head placed in a bag and being put to death. After that, they would be stuffed into a bag made of ox leather, along with other living animals, and placed in a wagon carried by oxen to a moving stream or the sea, where they would be dumped in. After that, they would be executed. Poena cullei was eventually changed to be replaced with being burned alive as the punishment. Scaphism. Those who were found guilty of significant crimes in ancient Persian society, such as treason or murder, were subjected to this particular form of torture. Inmates were held captive within a tree trunk that had been hollowed out or between two boats, which is why this practice was also known as the boats, and they were forced to consume milk and honey. It was necessary for this punishment to take place in a swamp or another location where the boats could be left out in the open and baked by the sun. In addition to being coerced against their will to consume the concoction, it was also liberally applied all over the parts of their bodies that were exposed. This would draw a variety of insects as well as rodents, both of which would essentially consume the victim while they were still alive. After a certain amount of time, those who had been affected by scaphism also suffered from acute diarrhea, which left them feeling exhausted and drained. However, despite having diarrhea and being dehydrated as a result, they did not pass away since they were continually made to consume more milk and honey. This indicates that they would be able to survive for days or possibly weeks in a miniature hell that consisted of their own feces, milk, honey, and consuming insects as food. The victim's excrement, which were allowed to accumulate, would eventually give rise to a swarm of maggots and other vermin. They would slowly find their way inside the body of the victim, where they would begin to consume them from the inside out, eventually leading to death. The breaking wheel. This gruesome instrument of torture was commonly employed throughout medieval ages in Europe. It was also referred to as the Catherine wheel due to its association with Saint Catherine of Alexandria. It enjoyed widespread use in France and Germany, and in some contexts, its application continued well after the end of the Middle Ages. It was given the moniker the breaking wheel due to the fact that its sole purpose was to fracture the skeletons of those who were forced to utilize it. This form of the death penalty was imposed on male criminals who had been found guilty of heinous homicide. The victim would then be tethered to the wheel, and a club or iron cudgel would be used to strike his limbs while he was still attached to the wheel. Once the victims were no longer able to fight off the effects of their wounds, the wheel could be used to expose their bodies. At other times, the prisoner would be subjected to days of torment on the wheel, while at other times, the executioner would inflict numerous strokes to the chest and stomach, also known as the coup de grâce, for a speedier death. Sometimes, the victim would suffer days of torture on the wheel. The actual mechanism of the wheel that was used to torture individuals differed from one nation to the next. In some renditions of the instrument of torture, a wooden cross was also included. The garrote. In 1812, as an alternative to hanging, the use of the garrote as a method of execution was first used. During the 19th century in Spain, at least 736 persons were put to death by hanging from a garrote. Those who were sentenced to die by hanging were typically determined to be responsible for serious crimes such as murder, banditry, or large acts of terrorism when they were tried and convicted of their crimes. After the inmates were situated with their backs against a post, a rope loop that was likewise linked to the pole would be placed around their necks. This procedure was repeated until the prisoners were dead. After that, the person being executed would be strangled with a stick that was put into the loop of the rope. In China, there was another form of this way of putting someone to death that involved the use of a bowstring. People who were sentenced to death by garroting were eventually subjected to a more humane method of execution, thanks to a number of reforms that were implemented over the course of time. The entire procedure of garroting was modified to include the use of a wooden stool that had bindings for the wrists and feet, along with an iron collar that hinged at the back and could be closed around the neck. A screw and lever device that had a star-shaped blade connected to it was included with the wooden stool that I purchased. After that, this would be inserted into the prisoner's neck in order to cut the spinal column, which would essentially stop the prisoner from suffocating to death. It was never certain that the victim would pass away, despite the fact that they typically lost consciousness somewhat rapidly and passed away within a few minutes of the attack. As a result of this, we came to the realization that this way of putting an inmate to death was never more rapid or humane than hanging. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.